Welcome to the Canadian Network on Cuba's podcast. One of the CNC's most urgent tasks is to counter the distortions of the Cuban reality by the mainstream Western media by disseminating information about the achievements of the Cuban Revolution in areas such as education, public health, culture, democracy, and human rights, and debunking disinformation about Cuba. I'm Samantha Hislop, co-chair of the CNC. On today's podcast, I'm joined by other executive committee members, Julio Fonseca, Isaac Saney, and Cam Scott, and we're going to be talking about why we started this podcast, the false stories about Cuban interference in U.S. and Venezuelan elections, and what a Kamala Harris-Tim Walz White House administration could mean for U.S. Cuba relations. Okay, Julio, can you just, for our audience, can you please give us just a general introduction about the blockade against Cuba and the state sponsors of terrorism list?
Muchas gracias, Samantha. La parte mía va a ser en español y quiero darles la bienvenida a este primer podcast de la Red Canadiense de Solidaridad con Cuba, de Canadian Network on Cuba. Nosotros vamos a producir una serie de podcasts sobre los temas más importantes relacionados con Cuba. Para hablar sobre el bloqueo de los Estados Unidos contra el pueblo cubano que demora ya más de 60 años. En primer lugar, yo creo que es un eufemismo llamarlo embargo, porque en realidad no es un embargo, es un bloqueo y aún más que un bloqueo, es una guerra económica que lleva a cabo el gobierno o que llevan a cabo los gobiernos de los Estados Unidos contra las familias cubanas. Como ustedes saben, este es un bloqueo que significa el mayor impedimento para el desarrollo de la economía en Cuba. Es el sistema de sanciones más abarcador que se ha conocido en la historia y que esta vez es impuesto por la mayor potencia del mundo en un país subdesarrollado o en vías de desarrollo, un país del tercer mundo y un país pobre. Hay que saber que el objetivo de este bloqueo es, en primer lugar, entorpecer todos los planes que tiene el gobierno cubano con la población en materia de programas educativos, de salud, y que los mayores afectados son los sectores más vulnerables de la sociedad, los ancianos, los niños, los enfermos. Este bloqueo también está pensado como un castigo a Cuba por exigir su derecho a la autodeterminación. Es una guerra que lleva a cabo Estados Unidos contra la Revolución Cubana en todos los frentes posibles. Nuestra mayor meta es terminar el bloqueo de los Estados Unidos contra Cuba, que está institucionalizado en los Estados Unidos. Es una ley donde solo el Congreso puede levantar este bloqueo. Entonces, Cuba ha pedido en los últimos años un acercamiento, digamos, práctico y creativo con respecto a los efectos de este bloqueo en la población. Porque nosotros pensamos que quizás el bloqueo no se va a levantar mañana ni pasado, y de modo que los cubanos hemos tenido que vivir con el bloqueo por más de 60 años, y lo que tenemos que hacer es enfrentarlo de una manera creativa. También Cuba cuenta con un movimiento de solidaridad en todo el mundo que es muy importante. Gracias a las voces de esta solidaridad, hay ahora un mayor conocimiento de lo que significa este bloqueo contra el pueblo cubano. Seguimos exigiendo decididamente que los Estados Unidos paren la guerra económica contra las familias cubanas. Pero además de todo eso, quizás la gente no sabe que durante el mandato de Trump, él impuso 243 medidas punitivas adicionales a todas las medidas que componen el sistema del bloqueo. Entonces, además de esto, Trump incluyó a Cuba en la lista de países o estados que patrocinan el terrorismo, cuando todos nosotros sabemos que esto es una gran mentira, es una gran fabricación, porque Cuba no patrocina el terrorismo. Cuba ha sido una víctima del terrorismo desde los primeros años del triunfo de la revolución. Y por lo tanto, entendemos que la inclusión de Cuba en esta lista no es más que otra grosera manipulación política para ejercer más presión sobre la situación que atraviesa el pueblo cubano. Exigimos además que los Estados Unidos eliminen a Cuba de esta lista donde todos sabemos que Cuba nunca debió estar. El objetivo es, como ya saben, entorpecer aún más todos los programas del gobierno cubano. Muchas gracias.
Thanks, Julio, for that. So a story just came out in the Miami Herald that is claiming that Cuba has been influencing the Florida elections. So, Isaac, what are your thoughts on that story?
Well, I think it's one of these normal falsehoods that are obviously floated by the United States every time to portray Cuba as a malevolent influence in the region. It's part and parcel and intimately tied to the economic war that's waged on Cuba that Julio so clearly laid out. Part and parcel of the destabilization campaign to undermine the Cubans' internal order and to obviously undermine the fact that Cuba represents an alternative to the rest of Latin America in terms of independence and in terms of trying to build a society built on social justice that attempts to use its limited resources for the benefits of the people. Linked to that has always been this attempt to portray Cuba as I said, a malevolent, a malign influence in the region. And obviously, Cuba has come out very clearly, not only to refute this, but numerous specialists know that Cuba has not been interfering in the U.S. elections or in Venezuela. It has expressed solidarity and has provided material solidarity to the Bolivarian Revolution by helping it in its social development. But it really flies in the face of reality when the United States talks about interference in the region. There have been so many coups and military dictatorships that the United States has supported. We only have to remember Operation Condor when it was exposed for the numerous assassinations and support that the United States gave to military dictatorships. We see the U.S. in recent times supporting a military coup in Honduras, right? We also see, for example, the United States spending tremendous amounts of money, not only in terms of the sanctions, for example, against Venezuela and Cuba, but openly financing groups to basically destabilize the political order of countries it considers not following its dictate and so forth. So I think the accusations that Cuba is somehow interfering in U.S. elections and somehow was fraudulently involved in Venezuela flies against the reality of what people have exposed, but clearly demonstrates that this is part and parcel of what the United States attempts to do, to turn reality on its head, right? And one of the things I think we have to do in the progressive world is to show how words are being manipulated. But the U.S. refers to as promoting democracy. It's promoting its imposition of its dictate, both economic and political. It's far against democracy, right? And in fact, Cuba, in a sense, has been promoting stability in the region through helping in social development. For example, counterposed, Operation Condor, which was the support for death squad regimes and military dictatorships and massive assassination programs across the region. We have Cuba with Operation Milagro, Operation Miracle, providing assistance to restore sight to those and to help people with their eye care for people who would never have access in the region, right? The numbers of doctors that have served in Venezuela and other places to provide people who didn't have access to healthcare. The number of students that Cuba has actually trained to go back and assist in the development of countries in Latin America, particularly doctors at the Latin American School of Medicine, right, have really shown that it is Cuba that in opposition to the United States, in contrast to the United States, has really been a force for stability and building the social development in those countries. And of course, we have the fact that while the United States has promoted and supported military dictatorships historically, while the United States is actively supporting coups, for example, what happened with Evo Morales, what happened in Honduras, right? Its destabilization of Nicaragua, its attempt to destabilize Venezuela, and of course, its ongoing more than 6-decade war against Cuba. We have Cuba trying to promote not just social development, but actively trying to bring about peace by mediating in various conflicts in Latin America. The most prominent, of course, being in Colombia, where Cuba provided the place and provided the kind of diplomatic assistance to end the civil war, to bring peace in Colombia. So obviously these ideas of Cuba intervening is simply reflects just one of the recycled, tired old stories that is actually circulated in the United States to destabilize Cuba and also to paint Cuba in the eyes of the people of the United States and in the eyes of the people of the region as being a malevolent force. But we know, and I'll end on this, that given the tremendous amount of support against the U.S. economic blockade, against U.S. economic war against Cuba, demonstrates that they will not fall for this propaganda, right? And I know that once again, the people of the Americas will reject these falsehoods and calumnies.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Also, in recent news, we know that the U.S. Democratic Party presidential candidate Kamala Harris has picked her new running mate, and that's Vice President candidate Tim Walz. So this is for Cam Scott. What might be the implications of this pick on the United States Cuba policy?
I believe that it should be regarded as a progressive development. Already, Kamala Harris is better on Cuba than many Democrats in 2020. She spoke against the embargo or properly blockade of Cuba. Walz has a proven record of support for Cuba in as much as you could characterize anyone in his position as being supportive of Cuba. In 2010, I believe he voted in favor of a bill to end all travel restrictions to Cuba. And that bill would effectively have allowed U.S. farmers to sell food to Cuba using or accepting credit. That's very significant, where Cuba is typically prohibited from accessing credit and has to pay up front for imports and so on. As significantly, in 2015, he co-sponsored the Free Trade with Cuba Act, which would have, in many respects, repealed the embargo. This was flagship legislation of the Obama era in its most progressive aspect, shall we say, that would have amended the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, repealed the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, the Libertad Act of 1996, and all kinds of other trade prohibitions and sanctions. It would have amended the tax code and regularized telecommunication services to a much further degree that we've seen had it not been effectively rolled back, reversed, warred upon by the Trump administration. So the Walz pick, I believe, places the Democratic ticket well ahead of the best expectations for Biden, in my opinion, who was nonetheless far better than Trump, in spite of having failed to significantly roll back Trump-era escalatory attacks.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Cam. Thank you for tuning in to the Canadian Network on Cuba's podcast. We'll see you next time.
The Cubacan Cares Campaign for Medical Sutures brings together the Canadian Network on Cuba and Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, fundraising to send 15,000 urgently needed sutures to Cuba. A needle and thread are a critical part of every surgical procedure. Everything from a minor cut to a microscopic procedure, from cesarean births to open heart surgery, requires sutures. Because of the illegal U.S. blockade, importing medical supplies to Cuba is extremely difficult, and Cuban doctors face nationwide shortages. Every suture we send could potentially save a life. Donate in Canada by e-transfer to donate@canadiannetworkoncuba.ca or visit cubacan.org for more information.